transgender identification is in free fall among young Americans. Now, this really, honestly, should not come as a surprise. To me, it doesn't. I foresaw this coming, and I think most of you probably had, because anyone with a brain had to have known that there's no way this movement could have lasted. It was idiocracy on display. It was completely anti-science. It didn't make any sense. And the idea that, well, we're going to take a mental illness and turn this into the factory default settings for everyone, including doctors and politicians, to buy into, there was just no way this was going to last. And the only reason why it lasted so long was because we had it gained steam during cancel culture, and it happened to be aligned with the radical lunatic left, who were employing brown shirt tactics. They had their enforcers. You had the Karenocracy. Let me speak to your manager types and their pedo attack dogs, all gathering together to make sure that this stuck. And anyone that was brave enough to notice that 2 + 2 might equal 4, and that men and women were, I know, shock and surprise, different, well, anyone who did that was banished into oblivion. And that was tough for a lot of people. I could understand that. If you've got something to lose and you're not willing to take that risk, well, you be quiet and hope it goes away, because most sane, rational people had to have believed that it wasn't going to gain as much steam as it did, and that it would die off, which, of course, we're now reaching the Overton window shift, where it's starting to be looked at as what it really is, insanity. But a lot of these people who did try to speak up early on were banned off the internet. They were depersoned. They were deplatformed. And they were cast out by the radical lunatic left and their allies as deplorables, the irredeemables. And so because of this, there was an explosion in self-identifying trans in schools and in colleges. It reached nearly 10%, which of course is insane. The gay community themselves is somewhere between 3.5% and 5% of the US population, but somehow trans had reached nearly 10%. There was no way it was real. But Gen Z and Gen Alpha, well, they were more likely to acquiesce to this movement, especially in those early days of cancel culture where you said the wrong thing and you were cast out. I knew people, and this is anecdotally, but I knew people who were teachers who would talk about how the children in schools would gather together to bully the bullies, to make their lives living hell. And everybody seemed to just stand by and let it happen. So this sort of thing just kept collecting and growing, and no one had the balls or the cojones to do anything about it. And then you add to the fact that there was a lot of white young men who were desperate to be accepted as part of any group, especially considering how they had become the scapegoats of all society's ills, both past and present. The radical lunatic left has decided that white man bad, European culture bad. And anything that you've done, and anything that happened before you were born, in fact, let's just go back 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 generations, you are to blame for this. And so these young men and women, but particularly white young men, were in a world of hurt and were looking for a way to be accepted, to get some kind of buffer between them and getting canceled for saying the wrong thing, for breathing the wrong way. I think this was a direct cause and effect as to why you saw the trans movement explode. Hordes of young people begin to self-identify. That number just skyrocketed out of the blue. All of a sudden, wow, I'm trans. And so you see all these people self-identifying as something that they weren't. They were not now, not ever. But it was the fashionable thing to do. It was the way to inoculate yourself from the lunatics. You could be a piece of shit. You could be an a-hole. As long as you were trans, then you were okay. If you were socially inept, well, I'm trans. It's fine. And it wasn't the mental illness of gender dysphoria wasn't the only one, mind you, that young people were attaching themselves to. There were a lot of social or mental illnesses that young people would attach to because, again, it made their issues or their weaknesses that could be pointed out by their classmates, by society, that they could block themselves from by saying, well, I'm autistic, I'm functionally retarded, and all this stuff. It was just a way to inoculate themselves from that. And I think this is why the best way to describe this is social contagion. Because don't get me wrong, there are real people who identify as trans who genuinely believe it, right? But most of these people who are identifying over the last decade were not. Now, maybe over time, because you can gaslight yourself into anything, maybe over time they begin to believe their own farts. I don't know. But there's no way that you see an explosion of a movement that's like 0.2%, 0.3% of the population to nearly 10% overnight. But that being said, just like the old fairy tale, The Emperor's New Clothes, where you've got a lord of the land getting bamboozled by a couple of tricksters into wearing pretend clothes, meaning he's wearing nothing, but gaslit into thinking that he's wearing magical clothes that only the wisest could see. And so, of course, all of his lords and ladies bought into it because they didn't want their heads to get chopped off. But eventually he gets exposed by a child pointing out the obvious lie that, hey, the emperor's a dummy. He's not wearing any clothes. And so, too, the trans movement has hit that brick wall. Where at some point you have to say, maybe there is a difference between men and women. I mean, every other species, it's different, but not humans. What is a woman? I don't know. At some point, the insanity and the absurdity of it had to have become obvious to everyone. At least that's what I think. Which then takes us back to the Breitbart story here. So this is by Catherine Hamilton. She writes, identifying as transgender and queer appears to be going out of fashion among young people, especially in elite settings. Yeah, it's not fashionable to say, hey guys, I'm mentally ill. I think where my penis is, a vagina might belong. Most people are going to know that that's batshit crazy. Now this is according to a new report from the Center for Heterodox Social Science. The report, authored by Eric Kaufman, director of the center and professor of politics at the University of Buckingham, found that transgender and queer identification has dropped sharply, surprise, surprise, among young Americans in Gen Z since 2023. Wow! Who could have thought that was going to happen? Who could have predicted? Now, Kaufman, Breitbart writes, analyzed troves of data from recent surveys about gender and sexuality, including the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, or FIRE. Boy, they love those acronyms. Their survey, and surveys from elite institutions like Andover Phillips Academy in Boston and Brown University. Kaufman wrote that whether trans and queer identities will drop to 2010 levels is an open question, but the fact both have declined sharply in just 2 years is a startling and unanticipated post-progressive development. I would argue very anticipated if you had a brain on your head, that the education and media establishments will be reluctant to acknowledge. Now, analyzing, Breitbart writes, raw data from the most recent FIRE survey, which polled over 60,000 students in 2025, Kaufman found that just 3.6% of respondents identified as gender other than male or female. And that's another thing I am glad to see the death of beginning, which is the recategorization of gender as anything other than its original intention, which was sex. Gender equals sex, but the attempt to undo that in the name of gender roles by the Karenocracy, the feminazis, their push to change the language helped destroy what sex was. And here we are suffering the consequences of that. Now, this figure compared to a 5.2% in 2024 and a 6.8% in 2022 and 2023. In other words, Kaufman writes, the share of trans-identified students has effectively halved in just 2 years. Kaufman found that surveys at Andover Phillips Academy and Brown University showed an even more pronounced trend. At Andover, 9.2% identified as neither male or female, in other words, they're insane, in 2023, but crashed to just 3% in 2025, meaning, oopsie-doopsie, cultural shift up. Let's get rid of this trendy, fashionable insanity. We're going back to normal. And at Brown University, that percentage has dropped from 5% in 2022 and 2023 to 2.6% in 2025. Now, when looking at more surveys, including sexual orientation, the data reflect uprising nonconformity from 2010 until 2023, followed by an almost 10-point swing back in 2024 and 2025. The end of the trans terror, I think, it's well underway now, and so that's why you're seeing a shift. It's the same thing, you're seeing this in movies and in gaming, where there is a clear, definitive rejection of these movements. And across the board, it's costing Hollywood, it's costing the gaming industry hundreds of millions, even maybe tens of billions or more dollars in lost revenue. And it's causing even some gaming studios to close because their projects are completely and utterly rejected. Because along with trans ideology, the uglification of society began. Now, interestingly, Kaufman writes, when the trans and queer trends were at their peak, freshmen were more likely to be non-conforming in their gender and sexuality than seniors, he noted. Now the BTQ, with the bisexual, trans, queer, or questioning identification, is in decline. The reverse is true. Younger students are less BTQ than older students in their colleges. This is a sign that fashions are indeed changing. Thank effing God. That's all I'm going to say. Now, Kaufman does not make any affirmative conclusions about the sudden rise and fall of young people identifying as transgender and queer, but points to some correlations in data worth further research. He said, what explains the sudden reversal of trans and queer? What could that possibly be? He says it's not because the kids became less woke, more religious, or more conservative. Those beliefs remained stable throughout the 2020s. Is it improved mental health? Yes, he says in part, less anxious and especially depressed students is linked with smaller share identifying as trans, queer, or bisexual. Well, the obvious thing is that the social trend has changed. The backlash is coming, and it's coming hard. And a lot of these young people are watching the destruction of trans ideology, and they don't want to be a part of it now. It's no longer sexy and cool to be in with a mental illness, to buy into the gender dysphoria. No one wants to look at their life and go, whoops, I wasted all of it. Now I can't get a job. They're starting to see cancel culture shifting and coming for the lunatics. Young people don't want to be a part of that. They were using the trans ideology as a way to elevate themselves, to give their life some sense of worth. Now, Kaufman goes on to say, now mental illness fell after the pandemic, but the sexuality and gender shifts happened at least a year later. All groups, including LGBT, well, come on, that's obvious. Why? It took time for people to realize that cancel culture no longer had the threat that it did before. Because make no mistake, once X, because if you look at the timeline, once X got bought out by Elon Musk and people could speak their minds and there wasn't a enforced conversation that trans equals good, trans equals normal, and people could say, fuck this shit and say whatever the hell they wanted online without fear of canceling, then guess what? Then people got brave and said, oh, let me change this. That's why there was a delay. Make no mistake. It wasn't that there was a genuine delay. It's just that people finally got brave enough when they saw the trends already shifting. Anyway, Kaufman goes on to say that all groups, including the LGBT, got less mentally ill after the pandemic. Now, again, I think that just has more to do with the fashion changes and the reopening up of free speech. No matter what people might think of Elon Musk, the one thing he did, which has an unimaginable positive effect on society, was buying X, was buying Twitter, and opening up, for the most part, freedom of speech. It's not all the way there, but it's a start. This has caused a seismic shift. It has exposed the lie, because the lie of trans ideology, the lie of the radical lunatic left, only worked as long as there was a monolith in the media. As long as they could enforce the conversation to flow one way, then you, who might think differently, felt like an outlier, felt like the whole world saw differently than you, and you would be more likely to shut the hell up. When you had the monopoly of the media prior to Fox News, prior to talk radio cropping up in the 1980s, you had a monolith of thought. This allowed them to control the old left, to control the narrative, to control the conversation. And once they lost that, they never quite forgave, especially in the media, the opposing voices. And now, of course, with social media, completely and entirely different. And then the end of this article says it happened largely independently of shifts in political beliefs and social media use, though improved mental health played a role. By the way, I also saw, before I jumped on here, there was a 2023 Williams Institute report which noted that the trans youth skew younger and more diverse racially, but the non-binary surge was white and more urban affluent, meaning it was a cool kid rebellion, which again goes back to what I was saying earlier about it being a white person, particularly white men, who were being ostracized. I mean, think about how everything in society has been blaming European white people as the ills of society. And when there was nothing to glom onto as a youth, and you had fully enforced cancel culture and censorship online, because the run-up to the pandemic, where you had the creation of the Trusted News Initiative. This was a cabal of news networks. The BBC, AP, Reuters got together with a bunch of NGOs, and they collaborated with all the social networks, all of them, including Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, to decide what conversations would be allowed. And especially once the pandemic kicked in, they used the excuse of medical misinformation as a way to control the narrative. And then by the time you had the election, this was the same group that would decide that the Hunter Biden laptop was not allowed to be discussed, and so on and so forth. And it just grew and grew and grew. So these young men in particular, and white women as well, the young white women out there, because they're still part of the half bad race. You were all bad if you were white male, you were half bad if you were white female, and especially if you were cis, aka normal. Then there was something wrong with you. So these young guys were looking for a way out, and trans offered that. But Elon Musk, taking over Twitter, blew up the game. In fact, he even jumped on, I don't have this already ready to go, but on X, he was talking about how the awful illusion of trans ideology is finally being shattered. So I don't know. I think it's a very great day for the world at large to see this movement in decline. I suspect it's going to continue to crater. And especially now that you're seeing, like with the gay community breaking from the trans movement, the mask is off and people are ready to say, to hell with this. So pretty much goodbye to self-identifying trans. It is on the decline.